20 million people were watching live when Johnny Carson did the unthinkable. He stopped his monologue and tore the script to pieces. Behind the scenes, network executives were screaming to cut the feed, but Johnny wasn't finished. This is the story of the red marker line, and the night the king of late night risked his entire career for one forbidden joke. The applause rolled in like a predictable tide, massive and warm. But for Johnny, it was just the start of the monologue machine, a process that had become as joyless and rigid as a federal budget hearing. He was the undisputed king of late night, yet he was constantly surrounded by an entire court, writers, producers, network executives, all determined to ensure that his kingdom never swayed, not even for a moment, into dangerous territory. The network's anxiety was personified by one man, Arthur Vance, a fictional executive vice president of standards and practices at the National Broadcasting Company. Vance was the kind of corporate titan who saw comedy not as an art form, but as a financial risk calculator. He was a man of bland suits, perpetually unhappy ties, and a clipboard filled with notes that amounted to one terrifying word: cut. To Vance, the most important metric wasn't laughter, it was sponsor stability. His presence backstage was a constant, icy reminder that every word Johnny uttered had been vetted, stamped, and approved. The monologue, which was meant to be Johnny's purest connection to the American psyche, had become a minefield. Jokes about political figures, international conflicts, or sensitive social issues were scrubbed clean with the obsessive diligence of a hazmat team. Johnny often felt he was talking to America through a filter of corporate fear, delivering comedy that was safe, palatable, and increasingly less honest. He was growing tired of the golden handcuffs, tired of the constraints placed on his creativity by men who cared more about the stock market than they did about punchlines. The tension in the writer's room had been suffocating. Arthur Vance, acting as the network's corporate executioner, had descended upon the draft with a thick red marker. His target, a masterful three-line jab at the Baron, a powerful official embroiled in a massive financial scandal. To the writers, the joke was a necessary truth. To Vance, it was a litigation nightmare that threatened major sponsors. "This stays out," Vance had growled, circling the text in a scarlet letter of censorship. "John's value is in his neutrality. Stick to airline food and weather gags." Johnny had watched the entire surgical operation from the coffee station, silent and distant. When Vance offered a condescending apology about protecting shareholders, Johnny merely offered an ambiguous nod, a gesture that left the staff trembling with both hope and anxiety. Now, under the studio lights, the approved script sat on Johnny's desk, marred by Vance's final written warning: do not deviate. As the audience settled, Johnny's gaze drifted to the control booth where Vance sat perched. The red circle wasn't just a corporate edit anymore, it was a challenge. The king of late night now had to decide whether to embrace the safety of his crown or risk his career for a few seconds of electrifying truth. Subscribe. If you want to see more deep dives into TV's most rebellious moments, hit that subscribe button now. The studio was thick with dread. Every staffer aware of the red marker line held their breath, fearing the censors but secretly hoping Johnny would defy them. As Ed McMahon's iconic introduction faded, 20 million viewers leaned in, but instead of the usual wave and smile, Johnny Carson did the unthinkable. He stopped. He stood motionless center stage, letting the applause wither into a heavy, liturgical silence. The pause stretched for 9 agonizing seconds, an eternity in live television. In the audience, the air grew brittle with confusion. At his desk, Ed McMahon maintained a rigid professional mask, sensing that this wasn't comedic timing, but a profound moral struggle. In the control booth, producer Arthur Vance watched the monitors with white-knuckled intensity. "What is he doing?" he hissed as Johnny ignored the teleprompter's approved jokes about the weather. Carson looked uncharacteristically tense, a man poised to dismantle a decades-long career of professional caution. Finally, Johnny stepped to the microphone and delivered a harmless, scripted joke. The audience roared with relief, but Vance wasn't fooled. To him, this brief return to the script felt like a tactical deception. The real threat remained clutched in Johnny's hand, a monologue that still held the potential to ignite. The applause for the third successful vetted joke rang out, a chorus of compliance that momentarily drowned out the anxiety humming beneath the surface of the Tonight Show set. Johnny Carson, having delivered 3 solid minutes of safe material, had established a false sense of security, pulling Arthur Vance and the network executives back from the immediate edge of panic. Now, the ticking clock was set at 2 minutes to mayhem. As Johnny reached the middle of the approved script, he casually picked up the papers from the stand, holding them loosely in his left hand. His right thumb rested deliberately over the approved joke that immediately preceded the forbidden material. For the audience, this was a characteristic gesture, a moment of easy, charming engagement. But for the writers and for Arthur Vance, it was a precise act of tactical deception. Inside the control booth, Vance leaned forward, his face inches from the main monitor. He saw the movement, noted the position of Johnny's thumb, and for a split second, a tremor of doubt ran through him. Was Johnny teasing? Was this a calculated maneuver to demonstrate his power? Vance adjusted his headset, ready to deliver a command that would either save the network millions or confirm Johnny's defiance. He's back on script, Vance thought, attempting to reassure himself. He wouldn't be this reckless. Yet on stage, Johnny felt an intense internal pull. The microphone seemed to amplify the silence in his own heart, which was no longer just about a job, but about a choice. He thought of the thousands of ordinary Americans whose savings had been swept away by the Baron, the man his joke targeted. His moral obligation to his audience, the people who trusted him to speak truth to power, weighed heavily against the corporate contract he held in his hand. He realized the contract in his hand was worthless compared to the promise he made to 20 million homes, the promise of truth. He delivered the next joke, a light-hearted jab at the state of public transport, and the audience responded instantly. Laughter is affirmation, Johnny thought. Laughter is permission. He felt the thrill of the tightrope walker, the moment when the wind picks up and the crowd holds its collective breath, knowing that one slight move could end the show, the career, everything. He looked directly at the script, then up toward the light that masked the control booth. He was giving Vance one final chance to intercede, one last moment before the point of no return. The physical atmosphere of the studio seemed to conspire with Johnny's tension. The stage lights felt hotter, the low hum of the massive studio cameras sounded louder, and the camera operators, sweating under their headsets, shifted nervously, sensing the atmosphere was charged with something beyond routine celebrity banter. The entire room knew, deep down, that the moment for the red marker line was approaching. The approved material was merely a diversion, a smokescreen to draw the network's eyes away from the 3 lines of comedy that were about to change the entire tenor of American late night. Johnny smiled the famous, genuine Carson smile, but his eyes, clear and sharp, held a dangerous resolve. He was just seconds away from the pivotal joke, the one that would determine if he was a comedian controlled by corporate fear or a man willing to sacrifice his comfort for the simple, undeniable truth. What would you do if you were in Johnny's shoes? Let us know in the comments if you'd risk it all for a joke. The moment arrived disguised as just another laugh. Johnny delivered the last safe joke, an innocuous piece of observational humor that elicited a final, predictable wave of studio laughter, convincing Arthur Vance in the control room that the crisis had passed. But as the sound began to fade, giving way to the gentle swell of Ed McMahon's trademark chuckle, Johnny did something that went entirely against the corporate script. He looked directly into camera 1, and his eyes, for the first time that night, were hard, cold, and utterly unforgiving. He paused just long enough for the audience to settle, recognizing the shift in the temperature of the room. Didn't smile. He didn't gesture. He simply spoke the words, clear as a bell, delivering the forbidden joke aimed squarely at the Baron, the corrupt official. I hear the Baron is thinking of renaming his massive estate Since he built it entirely on misappropriated public funds, he's going to call it the People's House of Cards. The silence was instantaneous. It wasn't the kind of silence that follows a bad joke. It was the kind of silence that follows a gunshot. The studio audience froze, a collective gasp held tight in their lungs. But it was more than shock. It was recognition. 20 million people, many of whom were directly affected by the man he joked about, instantly understood and silently affirmed the truth of Carson's words. They understood exactly who he was talking about and exactly what he was implying, that the official was a thief, protected by powerful interests. In the control booth, the immediate panicked reaction was primal. Arthur Vance vaulted from his chair, screaming into his headset. "Cut to commercial! Throw a graphic! Do something now!" He shouted at the audio engineer to dump the sound, to engage the 7-second tape delay, but it was too late. The words had already passed the point of no return, broadcast into 20 million living rooms across the nation, raw and unedited. The network's carefully constructed facade of political neutrality shattered like glass on the floor of Studio One. On stage, Johnny held the moment, letting the weight of the joke settle. He saw the look of utter professional dread on Ed McMahon's face. Ed knew, perhaps more than anyone, the depth of the trouble Johnny had just invited. Johnny looked back into the camera, a subtle, defiant smirk now touching his lips. He hadn't just told a joke. He had made a statement of conscience, breaking the fundamental rule of his tenure. Never, ever use The Tonight Show to deliver an unfiltered, uncomfortable truth. Vance watched, shaking with impotent rage, as the raw sound of the joke hung in the air, echoing back to him from the speakers. The camera operators, caught between their professional duty and the shock of the moment, kept their cameras steady, unable to look away from the icon who had just risked everything to speak his mind. Johnny Carson, the king of late night, had just willingly thrown a lit match into the network's carefully curated palace of advertising gold. He had delivered his verdict on the Baron, and in the process, delivered a challenge to the power structure that employed him. The moment of truth was over, but the reaction, the true fallout, had only just begun. The silence was not broken by Ed McMahon's nervous laughter or the bandleader Doc Severson's attempt at a musical segue. It was broken by the dry, crisp, tearing sound of paper, an unmistakable sound that instantly cut through the tension and delivered the ultimate shock to everyone watching. The sound of the paper tearing was the sound of the contract being invalidated, the sound of the ultimate rebellion against the corporate masters. Johnny Carson stood at the microphone, no longer holding a script, but holding two ragged, uneven halves of the official National Broadcasting Company monologue pages. With a sharp, sudden movement fueled by 2 decades of suppressed frustration, he tore the remaining approved script clean in half. The audience gasped, a sharp, collective intake of breath that was louder than any applause. This was no longer just about a joke. This was a physical, symbolic act of rebellion against the corporate control represented by the thick, angry red marker lines drawn by Arthur Vance. Johnny didn't just deviate from the script, he destroyed the instrument of his own censorship. Ed McMahon's famous, perpetually smiling face finally showed a flicker of genuine terror, his eyes wide as he realized the magnitude of the consequences they now faced. Backstage, the writers and producers exchanged horrified, yet strangely exhilarated glances. Their king was finally fighting back. But Johnny wasn't finished. He looked down at the torn halves of the paper, then lifted the pieces and, with a powerful, sweeping motion, he threw the shredded pages directly toward the camera lens. Specifically, he aimed the confetti of his defiance at camera 2, the camera that was transmitting the entire scene live to the nation. The paper, fluttering across the lens, briefly blinded the eye of the network, a spectacular visual representation of freedom. For a split second, the camera lens was obscured by the fluttering white paper, a momentary snowstorm of rebellion blinding the network eye. The act was breathtakingly defiant, a rejection of the entire rigid structure that controlled American late-night television. It was the visual equivalent of shouting, "I refuse to be managed." In the control booth, Arthur Vance was beyond rage. He was in a state of frantic, impotent collapse. "He's lost it. He's absolutely lost it. Get that man off the air," he roared, his voice cracking with panic. He knew that the joke itself would earn a severe reprimand, but the destruction of property and the visible, aggressive defiance broadcast live was a career-ending move, not just for Johnny, but potentially for everyone who couldn't stop him. Vance reached blindly for the red button that would cut the transmission, but his hand trembled too much to hit the mark cleanly. On stage, Johnny stood tall, breathing hard, the silence now settling into an almost religious reverence. He had delivered his punchline, and he had delivered his answer to the censors in one powerful gesture. He slowly walked back toward his desk, leaving the pieces of the torn script scattered on the carpet like the remnants of a failed treaty. The commercial brake light flashed red at that precise moment, signaling the end of the current, volatile segment. If you think this is the balliest move in TV history, share this with a friend who loves classic Hollywood. The screen cut abruptly to a cheery commercial for instant coffee, but the silence and civility ended the second the red tally light went dark. Before the sound of the commercial break music could even reach a crescendo, Johnny Carson, walking off the set with a look of calm resolve, was intercepted by a hurricane of corporate fury. Arthur Vance, his face a mottled crimson, burst from the control booth access door, charging onto the set with the speed and aggression of a man who had just seen his entire investment portfolio set ablaze. "What in the hell do you think you were doing, John?" Vance didn't ask a question. He delivered an accusation, his voice raw and shaking. He stabbed a finger toward the scattered pieces of the torn monologue script on the carpet, which a nervous stagehand was already scrambling to collect. "That joke was explicit. That paper was corporate property. You just breached contract, endangered the entire sponsorship base, and committed harakiri in front of 20 million people." Johnny merely raised an eyebrow, the picture of cool, detached authority. He took a slow, measured breath. The contrast between his practiced calm and Vance's visible meltdown, creating an unnerving tension. "Arthur," Johnny replied, his voice a low, dangerous murmur, "I was doing my job. My job is to tell people the truth. And right now, the truth about the Baron is that he's a thief who got away with stealing. The audience knows it, I know it, and you know it." Johnny's focus was not on the contract, but on the moral imperative. "Your job is to entertain," Vance shouted, leaning in so close that his spittle landed on Johnny's perfectly tailored tuxedo jacket. "Your job is to protect this network. You threw the script at the camera. We could be dismissed. We could lose millions." "Millions?" Johnny scoffed, the word heavy with contempt. "You're worried about millions in advertising when the man I joked about took billions from ordinary folks? Where is your outrage, Arthur? Where is your responsibility? I have a platform, and I have a moral obligation to the people who tune in every night and trust me not to lie to them." Vance's eyes narrowed, his features contorted by a furious calculation. "Obligation? Your only obligation is the one with the National Broadcasting Company logo on it. You think you're above the rules? You think I can't have your contract suspended tonight? You've given me every reason to walk you out of here and shut this entire operation down." Johnny met his gaze, the legendary coolness finally cracking just enough to show the deep conviction beneath. "Go ahead, Arthur. Try it. See how fast the country burns down your phone lines. See how many people choose you over the truth." He straightened his jacket, brushing off the imaginary dirt of Vance's anger. "I've been in this chair for 2 decades. I know this audience better than you know your own children. They tune in for authenticity. And tonight, I gave it to them. You may control the money, but I control the microphone." The floor manager, his face pale with worry, held up a clipboard, pointing frantically at the 10-second mark. The commercial break was nearing its conclusion. The confrontation had to end immediately. Vance looked from the desperate floor manager to Johnny's unflinching gaze. The power struggle was real, and for the first time, Vance realized that Johnny held the ultimate leverage, the unwavering loyalty of the American viewer. The contract threats died in his throat. He had lost. Vance stepped back, his face slack with defeat, whispering, "This isn't over, John, not by a long shot." Johnny simply straightened his tie and delivered a quiet, confident farewell before turning back to face the curtain. "For my sake, Arthur, I hope it is. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a guest waiting." The curtain opened, and Johnny Carson, having just survived the most dangerous 40 seconds of his career, walked back onto the brightly lit stage, leaving Arthur Vance standing alone in the shadows, choking on the stench of his own defeated authority. Arthur Vance, the great corporate gatekeeper, had been defeated by 3 lines of comedy and 1 man's integrity. The commercial break ended, and the cameras blinked back to life, broadcasting the return of the show. Johnny Carson was back at his desk, perfectly composed, seemingly untouched by the white-hot rage of the backstage confrontation that had just occurred. But his immediate action wasn't to look at the cue cards or greet the first guest. It was to look toward the familiar figures seated just to his right, needing confirmation that the most important human anchor in his professional life still held true. For decades, Johnny Carson carried the solitary weight of the show. He sat alone in the spotlight, knowing the entire operation rested on his shoulders. But he was never truly alone. That figure was Ed McMahon, the voice of the show, the ultimate loyal partner. Their working relationship spanned decades, built on unspoken understanding, shared glances, and the mutual knowledge of the thousands of secrets held behind the desk. Tonight, that bond was being tested in a way it never had been before. Johnny needed to know, had he truly alienated the only man who knew the pressure of his crown? Johnny's look was quiet, searching, and deeply vulnerable. It lasted only a second, maybe 2. But in that intimate, televised pause, all the years of partnership, loyalty, and friendship hung in the balance. Ed, sensing the silent plea, kept his professional smile firmly in place, knowing that any outward sign of panic would only validate Arthur Vance's corporate fury. But Ed's response was not verbal. It was a subtle, powerful communication sent across the vastness of the stage. He offered the briefest, most genuine nod, a nod that meant, "I saw what you did, I know why you did it, and I am with you." It was a vow of loyalty that transcended network contracts and sponsor fears. It was the unspoken understanding between 2 professional brothers. In a world of corporate mandates, they would stand together for the truth. The tension in the room instantly softened for Johnny. That single, silent gesture from Ed was more validating than 1,000 standing ovations. It was a reminder that he wasn't alone in his defiance, that someone else recognized the difference between playing safe and playing honest. This confirmation from Ed was the shield Johnny needed against the coming corporate storm. Johnny then turned, picked up the conversation, and smoothly introduced the first guest. When he announced the name, Ed McMahon, with a strength and enthusiasm that startled the camera operators, delivered his signature exclamation, "Hoo-ee!" But tonight, that famous declaration of excitement was amplified. It wasn't just a show cue, it was a subtle, amplified cheer for Johnny, an endorsement of his bravery, a quiet rejection of the censorship that had just been defied. Ed's "Hoo-ee!" sounded like a rallying cry for the audience at home, confirming that their host was a hero, not a fool. In the shadows near the access door, Arthur Vance watched the exchange, his face still flushed with anger, but now laced with a growing sense of defeat. He understood the language of the stage. Ed McMahon's immediate, unflinching loyalty was an impenetrable barrier. Vance might have the power to suspend Carson's contract, but he did not have the power to break that decades-long friendship, nor the power to control the cultural narrative that the 2 men had built together. Ed's support solidified the moment. This was not a star having a breakdown. This was a principled stand supported by the most trusted second voice in television. The rest of the show continued in a surreal blur. Johnny was sharp, funny, and utterly brilliant, liberated by the act of defiance. The joke that horrified the censors had, paradoxically, re-energized the king. He knew that the battle with the network was far from over, but as long as Ed McMahon was sitting beside him, ready with a laugh and an unspoken vow of support, Johnny knew he could face any corporate firestorm that came next. His defiance had secured his truth, and his partnership had secured his soul. The next morning, the city of Los Angeles woke up to a seismic shift that had nothing to do with geology. The newspaper headlines screamed the news in bold, contradictory fonts. One column, often the editorial page, condemned Johnny Carson's irresponsible, politicized comedy and demanded an immediate apology to the offended official. But the opposite column, the one that truly captured the nation's heart, hailed Carson as a courageous voice of the people, praising his daring act of televised truth. The phones at National Broadcasting Company headquarters began ringing before 7 o'clock in the morning, a cacophony of corporate panic and public fervor. The calls were almost evenly split between furious sponsors threatening to pull multi-million-dollar contracts and ecstatic viewers, often ordinary men and women who had watched their savings dwindle under the Baron's corrupt policies, calling simply to say, "Thank you, Johnny." For once, the silent majority had a voice, and it was loud, organized, and fiercely loyal to the man who risked his crown for them. The volume of support for Johnny was so overwhelming that the network recorded a 5,000% increase in support of viewer mail that morning. Arthur Vance walked into his office that morning, looking like a general who had just lost the war. He fully expected the meeting that followed to be his finest hour, the moment he would receive authorization to suspend Carson and restore corporate order. He came prepared with charts detailing the potential loss of revenue and the legal risk associated with the joke. Vance was prepared to throw away the cornerstone of the network to save face, but the network president, a shrewd man who understood that public perception sometimes trumped profit, only smiled sadly. He pointed to the overnight ratings. They hadn't just held steady, they had spiked dramatically. The audience who tuned in for safe, familiar comedy had been thrilled by the moment of genuine, dangerous honesty. "You don't understand, Arthur," the president said, tapping a memo about a 5,000% increase in support of viewer mail. "John didn't lose the audience. He just earned them for life. He proved he's not our puppet. He proved he's their champion." The threatened sponsor exodus, which Vance had predicted would be catastrophic, never fully materialized. The few companies that did pull out were quickly replaced by rivals who saw the spike in the show's cultural relevance as a far more valuable commodity than political correctness. Johnny Carson had not only survived the firestorm, he had emerged from it stronger, validated by the very audience the network had tried to protect him from. This massive public vindication slowly, quietly, sealed Arthur Vance's fate. His cold, calculating corporate caution was revealed to be a weakness, not a strength. He hadn't protected the network. He had nearly throttled its greatest asset. Within 3 months of that night, Arthur Vance was quietly offered an early retirement package, a golden handshake that served as a subtle but undeniable acknowledgement that the power balance had shifted permanently. He vanished from the corporate suites, the forgotten victim of a comedian's choice to speak the truth. Johnny, however, never gloated. He simply carried on, the joke a subtle, living reminder that he alone had the final say. The real tear-jerking victory was that his act of defiance had not only saved his professional soul, but had shown millions of people that even the king of late night believed that truth and integrity were more important than any career, any contract, or any amount of corporate fear. He had won, not with a lawsuit, but with a punchline, proving that the microphone was still mightier than the corporate marker. The years passed, marked by the comfortable routine of late-night television, but that moment of fierce rebellion, the instant Johnny Carson tore his script and threw it toward the camera, never truly vanished. It became a whisper, an urban legend among the show's staff, occasionally mentioned by a former writer or a longtime sound engineer, always spoken with a hushed reverence. It wasn't until decades later, well after Johnny had retired, that the full, tender, private truth about that night was finally revealed. It was reported by a veteran stagehand, a man who had cleaned Studio One for 30 years and had always been fond of sharing the backstage folklore with the young production assistants. He recalled a seemingly innocuous object taped underneath Johnny's mahogany desk, the same desk where the king of late night sat for 25 years. Taped to the underside of the central drawer, where no camera could ever find it, were the 2 ragged, torn halves of the forbidden monologue script. Johnny hadn't thrown away the evidence of his defiance. He had preserved it. He had carefully taped the pages back together and secured them where he could touch them, unseen, every single night before the show began. It wasn't a memento of a fight. It was a physical reminder of his own personal line in the sand. It was the moment he chose integrity over comfort, truth over millions. The core theme of the story is the trust Johnny earned that night. He taught the entire country, and perhaps himself, that a true voice, a voice willing to risk everything, is the most powerful force in the media. He connected to his audience not as a celebrity, but as an honest person, unafraid of the powerful. The simple, raw act of defying censorship became an unspoken vow between Carson and his viewers. I will never lie to you, and I will never let them silence the truth. This deep, honest connection became the true legacy of the joke. It changed the way Johnny approached his work, infusing his later interviews and monologues with an enhanced sense of moral responsibility. He had found his ultimate purpose, to use his fame not merely for entertainment, but as a protective shield for honesty. On his very final episode in 1992, when the emotional goodbyes were being delivered and the lights were dimming on the Tonight Show stage for the last time, a member of the crew recalled seeing Johnny touch the underside of his desk one last time. He reached down, his fingers brushing the ragged, taped edges of the paper one last time. A final, silent salute to the piece of paper that saved his soul. It was a brief, almost invisible movement, a final connection to the torn script that had anchored his conscience for so long. He didn't take the pages with him. He left them behind, taped beneath the desk. A silent, powerful testament to the writers, producers, and all who came after him. The joke that horrified the censors became the joke that set the king free. It confirmed that the most successful man on television measured his success not by his ratings or his endorsements, but by his willingness to confront the powerful and speak for the ordinary person. He had shown the world that courage is the best punchline, and that sometimes the only way to save your career is to be willing to give it up for something you believe in. He had defied the censors and won, securing his place not just as a legend of comedy, but as a hero of genuine integrity. The ultimate tragedy is that Arthur Vance, the man obsessed with money and contracts, lost his job, his power, and his respect, while Johnny Carson, the man willing to risk everything, secured his immortality. The moral is simple. Always choose the joke that matters. The joke that horrified the censors became the ultimate love letter to his audience. Johnny Carson's defiance proved that the most powerful script isn't written by a network, it's written by a man's conscience. By tearing up the red marker line, he didn't just save his integrity, he defined an era of television where truth was the ultimate punchline. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the night the king of late night fought back, please like this video to support stories of creative courage. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to join us for more legendary moments from Hollywood history. And let us know in the comments if you would have torn up the script or played it safe for the crowd. Thanks for watching, and remember, always choose the joke that matters.